Hello, and welcome to Day 7 of Topher Reads The Hobbit. I had to make a decision about how I would handle a particular character over the next couple of days, and in the end I decided to go with the classic, as they say. So, let's get on with Riddles in the Dark. Deep down here by the dark water lived old Gollum, a small, slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two big, round, pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he rowed about quite quietly on the lake, for a lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled it with large feet dangling over the side, but never a ripple did he make, not he. He was looking out of his pale lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as thinking. He liked meat, too. Goblin, he thought, quite good when he could get it, but he took care that they never found him out. He just throttled the goblins from behind if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water while he was prowling about. They very seldom did this, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. They had come on the lake when they were tunneling down long ago, and they found that they could go no further. So their road ended in that direction, and there was no reason to go that way unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes the great goblin took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither the goblin nor fish ever came back. Actually, Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether flummoxed and at the end of his way and his wits. And suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed. "Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast, at least a tasty morsel it'd make us, Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat, and that is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came into his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him. "What is he, my precious?" whispered Gollum, who was always speaking to himself, though never having anyone else to speak to. This is what he had come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment, only curious, otherwise he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. "I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins. I have lost the dwarves, and I have lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am, and I don't want to know, if only I can get away." "What has he got in his hands?" looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. "A sword, a blade which came out of Gondolin." said Gollum, and he became quite polite. "Perhaps he sits here and chats with it a bitsy, my precious. It likes riddles, perhaps it does it?" He was anxious to appear friendly at any rate for the moment, until he found out more about the sword and the hobbit, and whether he was quite alone really, and whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them and sometimes guessing them had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago, before he lost all his friends, and he was driven away, alone, and crept down, down into the dark under the mountains. "Very well," said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree until he found out more about the creature, and whether he was quite alone, and whether he was fierce or hungry, and whether he was a friend of the goblins. "You ask first," because he had not had time to think of a riddle. So Gollum hissed,
What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees. Up, up, up it goes, and yet it never grows.
Oh, that's easy. Mountain, I suppose.
Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, Precious. If Precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us and we don't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We shows it the way out, yes?
All right, said Bilbo, not daring to disagree and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, and then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old riddle, too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do.
Chestnuts, chestnuts, teeth, teeth, my precious, but we only has 6.
And then he asked his second.
Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters.
Half a moment. Bilbo was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. Ah, wind. Wind, of course. And he was so pleased that he made up one on the spot. This'll puzzle the nasty little underground creature, he thought. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in a low place, not in high place.
Said
Gollum. He had been underground a very long time and was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages and ages before, when he lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by a river.
My precious. Sun on the daisy, it means it does.
But these ordinary above-ground, everyday sorts of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry, so this time he tried something a bit more difficult and a bit more unpleasant.
It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, an empty hole as it fills. It comes first and follows after. It ends life and it kills laughter.
Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all around him anyway. Dark, he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. A box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. He asked to gain time until he could think of a really hard riddle. This, he thought, was a dreadfully easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual words, but it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. Gollum hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and spluttered. After some time, while Bilbo became impatient, "Well, what is it? The answer's not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise that you were making."
Give us a chance, let us give us a chance, my precious.
Well, said Bilbo after giving him a long chance, what about your guess? But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago and sitting under the riverbank teaching his grandmother to suck
eggs. Eggs it is.
And then he asked,
alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking.
He also, in his turn, thought this was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer, but he could not remember anything better at the moment. He was so flustered by the egg question. All the same, it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who had never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it as easy as winking, since you are sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking. Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. And after a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself.
Is it nice, my precious? Is it juicy? Is it scrumptiously crunchable?
He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. "Half a moment, please. I gave you a good long chance just now."
"It must make haste, it must make haste,"
said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat onto the shore to get at Bilbo, but when he put his long, webby foot into the water, a fish jumped out in a fright and fell on Bilbo's toes. "Ugh, it is cold and clammy." And so he guessed. "Fish! Fish!" he cried. "It is fish." Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as he ever could, so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. "No legs lay on one leg, 2 legs sat near on 3 legs, 4 legs got some." It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it if he had asked it at another time. As it was, talking of fish, no legs was not so very difficult, and after that the rest was easy.
"Fish on a little table, man at table sitting on a stool, the cat has the bones."
That, of course, is the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. And then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible, and this is what he said.
"This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down."
Poor Bilbo sat in the dark, thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever heard told of in tales. But not one of them had done all of these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different than that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time!" But all that came out with a sudden squeal was, "Time! Time!" Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry, and also tired of the game. It made him feel hungry indeed, and this time he did not go back to the boat. He sat down in the dark by Bilbo, and that made the hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits.
"It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes, just one more question to guess. Yes?"
But Bilbo simply could not think of any question with that nasty, wet, cold thing sitting next to him, and pawing, and he was poking at him. He scratched himself, he pinched himself, but still, he could not think of anything.
Ask us,
said Gollum. Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself. He gripped on his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand, and there he found the ring he had picked up in the passage and had already forgotten about. What have I got in my pocket?" he said aloud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and he was frightfully upset.
Not fair. It's not fair. It isn't fair, my precious, is it, to ask us what it's got in its nasty little pocketses?"
Bilbo, seeing what had happened, and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question. "Well, what have I got in my pocket?" he said louder.
"It must give me 3 guesses, my precious, 3 guesses."
Oh, well, very well. Guess away.
Handses.
Wrong, said Bilbo, who had luckily just taken his hand out again. Guess again.
Yeah.
Gollum was more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he kept in his own pockets. Fish bones, goblins' teeth, wet shells, a bit of bat wing, a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think of what other people kept in their pockets.
Knife?
Wrong, said Bilbo, who had lost his knife some time ago. Last guess. And now Gollum was in a much worse state than when Bilbo had asked him the egg question. He hissed and spluttered and rocked himself backwards and forwards and slapped his feet on the floor and wriggled and squirmed. But still he did not dare to waste his last guess. Come on. I am waiting. He tried to sound bold and cheerful, but he did not feel at all sure how the game was going to end and whether Gollum guessed right or not. Time's up!
String or nothing,
shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, working in two guesses at once. Both wrong, cried Bilbo, very much relieved, and he jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall, and held out his little sword. He knew, of course, that the riddle game was sacred and of immense antiquity, and even wicked creatures were afraid to cheat when they played at it, but he felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise at a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slide out of it, and after all, that last question had not been a genuine riddle according to the ancient laws. But at any rate, Gollum did not at once attack him. He could see the sword in Bilbo's hand. He sat still, shivering and whispering, and at last Bilbo could wait no longer. Well, what about your promise? I want to go. You must show me the way.
Did we say so, precious? Show the nasty little Baggins the way out? Yes, yes. But what has it got in its pockets, eh? Not string, precious, but not nothing. Oh, no, Gollum.
Never you mind. A promise is a promise.
Cross it is, impatient, precious. But it must wait. Yes, it must wait. We can't go up the tunnel so hasty. We must go and get some things first. Yes, things to help us.
Well, hurry up. Relieved to think that Gollum was going away, he thought he was just making an excuse and did not mean to come back. What was Gollum talking about? What useful thing could he keep out on that dark lake? But he was wrong. Gollum did mean to come back. He was angry now, and he was hungry, and he was a miserable, wicked creature, and already he had a plan. Not far away was his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, and there in his hiding place he kept a few wretched oddments and one very beautiful thing. Very beautiful, very wonderful. He had a ring, a golden ring, a precious ring.
My birthday present,
he whispered to himself, as he often had done in the endless dark days.
That's what we want now. Yes, we want it.
He wanted it because it was a ring of power, and if you slipped that ring on your finger, you were invisible, and only in the full sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow, and that would be shaky and faint.
My birthday present. It came to me on my birthday, my precious.
So he had always said to himself, but who knows how Gollum came by that present ages ago in the old days when such rings were still at large in the world. Perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Gollum used to wear it at first, till it tired him, and then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin until it galled him, and now usually he hid it in a hole in the rock on his island, and was always going back to look at it, and still sometimes he put it on when he could not bear to be parted from it any longer, or when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish, and then he would creep along dark passages looking for stray goblins. He might even venture into places where the torches were lit and they made his eyes blink and smart, for he would be safe. Oh yes, quite safe. No one would see him, no one would notice him until he had his fingers on their throat. Only few hours ago he had worn it and caught a small goblin imp, and how it squeaked. He still had a bone or two left to gnaw, but he wanted something softer for now.
Quite safe, yes, he whispered to himself. It won't see us, will it, my precious? No, it won't see us, and its nasty little sword will be useless. Yes, quite useless.
That is what was in his wicked little mind as he slipped suddenly from Bilbo's side and flapped back to his boat and went off into the dark. Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him, and still he waited a while, for he had no idea how to find his way out alone. Suddenly he heard a screech. It sent a shiver down Bilbo's back. Gollum was cursing and wailing away in the gloom, not very far off by the sound of it. He was on his island, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain.
Where is it? Where is it?
Bilbo heard him crying.
Lost it is! My precious is lost! Curse us and crush us! My precious is lost!
What's the matter? Bilbo called. What have you lost?
It mustn't ask us. Not its business. No, Gollum. It's lost. Gollum. Gollum.
Well, so am I. And I want to get unlost, and I won the game, and you promised. So come along. Come and let me out, and then go on with your looking. Utterly miserable as Gollum sounded, Bilbo could not find much pity in his heart, and he had a feeling that anything Gollum wanted so much could hardly be something good. Come along!
No, not yet, precious,
Gollum answered.
We must search for it. It's lost, Gollum.
But you never guessed my last question, and you promised.
Never guessed.
Then suddenly out of the gloom came a sharp hiss.
What has it got in its pockets? Tell us that. It must tell us first.
As far as Bilbo knew, there was no particular reason why he should not tell him. Gollum's mind had jumped to a guess quicker than his, naturally, for Gollum had brooded for ages on this one thing, and he was always afraid of it being stolen. But Bilbo was annoyed at the delay. After all, he had won the game pretty fairly at a horrible risk. Answers were to be guessed and not given, Bilbo said.
But it wasn't a fair question. Not a riddle, precious, no.
Oh, well, if it's a matter of ordinary questions, then I asked one first. What have you lost? Tell me that.
What has it got in its pockets?
The sound came hissing louder and sharper, and as he looked towards it, to his alarm, Bilbo now saw two small points of light peering at him. As suspicion grew in Gollum's mind, the light in his eyes burned with a pale flame. What have you lost? Bilbo persisted, but now the light in Gollum's eyes had become a fire green, and it was coming swiftly nearer. Gollum was in his boat again, paddling wildly back to the dark shore, and such a rage of loss and suspicion was in his heart that no sword had any more terror for him. Bilbo could not guess what had maddened the wretched creature, but he saw all was up, and that Gollum meant to murder him at any rate. Just in time he turned and ran blindly back up the dark passage down which he had came, keeping close to the wall and feeling it with his left hand.
What has it got in its pockets?
He heard the hiss loud behind him and the splash as Gollum leapt from his boat. What have I got, I wonder? He said to himself as he panted and stumbled along. He put his left hand in his pocket. The ring felt very cold as it quietly slipped onto his groping forefinger. The hiss was close behind him. He turned now and saw Gollum's eyes like small green lamps coming up from the slope. Terrified, he tried to run faster, but suddenly he stuck his toes on a snag on the floor and fell flat with his little sword underneath him. In a moment, Gollum was on him. But before Bilbo could do anything, recover his breath, pick himself up, or wave his sword, Gollum passed by, taking no notice of him, cursing and whispering as he ran. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. See you all tomorrow.